The moment Lillian Marlowe drew her last breath of free air, she knew the ranch would outlive her, but she had no idea who it would choose. Sunlight sliced through the dusty horizon in jagged orange streaks, catching the cracked wooden boards of the corral and setting the rusty hinges of the barn doors aglow. The wind carried the dry, bitter scent of sagebrush and the faint metallic tang of distant gunfire from skirmishes she had long tried to ignore. Her chest ached, each shallow inhale a reminder that the illness gnawing at her insides had claimed more than her strength. It had claimed her time. She sat propped against the worn porch railing, the leather of her gloves cracked from years of sun and toil. Fingers trembling, she clutched the deed to the ranch, her knuckles white against the parchment. Lillian's eyes scanned the horizon, tracing the faint shimmer of heat that danced over the mesas. Her breath caught as a solitary figure appeared, riding at the edge of the ridge's silhouette she had summoned. With equal parts hope and dread, the horse beneath him kicked up clouds of red dust with each deliberate step, nostrils flaring, eyes wide and alert. The man on its back moved like a shadow, silent but commanding, the sunrise glinting off the beads and feathers braided into his long black hair. Lillian's pulse raced. She had sent word to a warrior known only through whispers in nearby towns, a man who seemed to belong to the land itself, feared by some, respected by many. He was rumored to be untouchable by threats, swift as the river in flood, and silent in ways that unsettled even the bravest cowboys. "Is it him?" She whispered to no one, her voice cracked and raspy from the fever. A crow cawed in reply, circling overhead, its shadow falling like a dark finger across the porch. Her horse, a chestnut mara named Daisy, pawed the dirt nervously, sensing the tension in the air. Lillian gripped the deed tighter, the paper folding into her palm as if it were alive. The figure slowed as he reached the bottom of the slope. Lillian noticed the way his bare chest caught the morning light, bronzed and sculpted, muscles coiled beneath the skin like the ropes of a taut lasso. His gaze lifted, piercing the distance, and landed on her. She felt impossibly as though he could see into her bones, into the very marrow of her weakness and fear. He dismounted with effortless grace, the horse stamping impatiently, snorting clouds of dust that clung to Lillian's hair and eyelashes. Lillian rose slowly, her legs shaking as if they might buckle beneath her. Every sound seemed amplified, the creak of the porch boards beneath her boots, the swish of wind through the sage, the distant rustle of a hawk circling overhead. "Lillian Marlowe," the warrior said, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of calm inevitability. "I am Takoda." Each syllable seemed deliberate, measured, as though he was testing the very air between them for truth. Lillian's lips trembled as she managed a nod, unable to speak beyond a shallow rasp. She extended her hands, offering the deed to the man whose name she had only ever heard in fearful reverence. He took it with one hand, his fingers brushing hers briefly. The touch was brief but electric, a spark that seemed to travel straight to her chest, making it ache in a strange, unfamiliar way. Dust swirled between them like a living thing, caught in the shafts of sunlight, obscuring the land she had tended for nearly all her life. She looked past him, across the sprawling fields, the corral, the barn, everything she had built, fought for, and now had to let go. Takoda's eyes scanned the horizon, and for a moment the wind seemed to still, holding its breath. Lillian could not tell if he was surveying the land or the future, or if his gaze simply reflected the weight of lives intertwined with the soil. His hand returned the deed to her, not in ownership but in recognition, as if acknowledging the gravity of the choice she had made. "Your life will not linger long," he said softly, almost to himself. "But the land will remember." The words struck her harder than any blow. Lillian sank onto the porch steps, coughing violently, each hack racking her fragile frame. Her eyes watered, blurring the man before her, the sun, the dusty horizon, until they became a single glow, a promise, a question. The deed lay heavy in her lap, a threshold between her dwindling existence and the legacy she hoped would endure. And in that moment, as the wind tugged at her hair and the first cries of morning birds echoed across the valley, Lillian understood. She had sold more than a ranch. She had entrusted a piece of her soul to a stranger whose arrival had already begun to change everything. The wind carried a strange calm, as if the land itself held its breath, waiting. Lillian Marlowe sat on the porch, her thin frame shaking from fever and anxiety, watching Takoda move with the quiet authority of someone born from the earth itself. The horse stamped impatiently nearby, its hooves stirring clouds of dust that clung to his bronzed skin and the long black hair that cascaded over his broad shoulders. Beads and feathers braided into his hair shimmered like embers in the rising sun, moving with him as he adjusted the leather strap of a small pouch at his side. Takoda's gaze swept over the ranch with meticulous precision. Every corner, every fence post, every dusty corral spoke to him in whispers only he could hear. Lillian's breath caught as she noticed the way he paused at the barn, his hand resting lightly on the weathered wood, tracing the grain as though sensing the life it had held. Her chest tightened not with fear entirely, but with the strange awe that comes when you meet someone whose presence seems larger than life. "Why have you come alone?" she croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her fingers trembled against the rough wooden railing, clutching the deed as if it were a lifeline. Takoda turned slowly, his dark eyes meeting hers, calm but unreadable. "Some battles are not fought with numbers," he said, voice low and steady, carrying the weight of authority and quiet patience. "Some land must be understood before it is protected." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Lillian shivered, unsure if it was the morning chill or the intensity in his gaze that made her feel so exposed. He dismounted, the horse snorting and pawing at the earth, kicking up tiny clouds of dust. Each movement was deliberate, smooth, and impossibly silent despite the weight of his frame. Lillian, weak and frail, found herself instinctively standing straighter, drawn to his presence even as her body ached from illness. The sight of him muscular, bare-chested, decorated in tribal jewelry and feathers was almost surreal against the orange-red backdrop of the mesa. He seemed less a man and more a living force of nature, rooted in the land yet untamed by it. Takoda approached slowly, his boots crunching softly against the dry soil. Lillian noticed scars along his forearms, faded and jagged, like stories carved into flesh. Each mark seemed to whisper a tale of survival, of battles fought in silence and honor. Her throat tightened. She wondered briefly if he had seen death more often than life, if he had lost more than she could imagine. "You? You're taking this land," she stammered, her voice catching on the last word. "All of it? Why?" He studied her with a quiet intensity. "Not for me," he said, finally. "For those who need it. For those who will defend it." There was a pause, a long, measured silence that stretched between them like the vast sky overhead. "You have given this place a chance to live beyond you. That is rare." Lillian felt tears prick her eyes. Her hands, pale and trembling, gripped the railing as she tried to absorb the enormity of what she had done. She had sold the ranch to a man she barely knew, a man who carried the weight of entire tribes and untold battles in his presence alone. And yet, in some inexplicable way, she felt the first flicker of hope she had known in months. Perhaps this land would not die with her. Perhaps it would thrive under someone who truly understood it. Takoda crouched slightly, lowering himself to meet her eye level. He reached out just enough to touch the parchment of the deed in her hands. The gesture was light, respectful, almost reverent. Lillian's heart thudded painfully in her chest. The contact was brief, but electric, like a spark jumping across two worlds. "The land will remember your care," he murmured, almost to himself. It will remember you." His gaze lifted, sweeping the ranch again, taking in the corral, the fields, the distant ridges where wild horses grazed. "And one day, it will repay that memory in ways you cannot yet see." The wind picked up, rustling the sagebrush and carrying the scent of the desert dry earth, dust, and the faint metallic tang of iron from the distant hills. Lillian closed her eyes, letting the sun warm her pale face, listening to the quiet strength in his presence. For the first time since she had fallen ill, she felt something stir in her chest, a fragile hope that the ranch and perhaps something of herself might endure. Takoda straightened, moving back toward his horse, the beads and feathers in his hair catching the sun like sparks. Lillian watched him, knowing instinctively that this man was unlike anyone she had ever met. Silent, powerful, rooted in the land yet untouchable in ways she could not yet understand. And somehow she trusted him, not fully, not yet, but enough to know that the next chapter of her ranch's story and her own fading life was now in his hands. The sun climbed higher, painting the landscape in brilliant golds and reds, and Takoda mounted his horse again, ready to roam the land he had just claimed, not with violence, but with a quiet, commanding vigilance. Lillian, leaning weakly against the railing, held the deed close to her chest and whispered a prayer she wasn't sure anyone would hear. The future was uncertain, and yet, for the first time in a long while, it felt alive. Night fell like a velvet curtain over the Marlowe ranch, swallowing the mesas and corral in shadows that shifted with every gust of wind. Lillian Marlowe leaned weakly against the railing of the porch, her body trembling from the fever that gnawed at her bones. The sickly moonlight cast pale, silver streaks across the land, illuminating the uneven boards of the barn and the dusty corral. Even the wind seemed hushed, as though it too respected the silence that had settled over the ranch. Takoda had chosen to remain outside for the night. Lillian had noticed him moving quietly among the fields, barefoot against the cold dirt, his long black hair and tribal jewelry catching what little moonlight there was. Each movement was deliberate, fluid, and strangely hypnotic, as if the earth itself guided his steps. He crouched near the corral, scanning the horizon with eyes that missed nothing, while the horse he had brought nickered softly. Sensing the tension in the air. Despite the darkness, Lillian could hear other sounds, soft, deliberate footsteps that did not belong to the horse or the wind. The faint rustle of cloth against leather, a whisper of movement across dry grass. Her heart raced. She wanted to call out, but her voice caught in her throat, fragile and hoarse from illness. Instead, she pressed her thin hands to her chest, feeling her heart thud like a drum in the stillness. "Who comes with you?" She whispered into the night, though no answer came. Only the quiet shuffle of Takoda's presence, steady and unwavering, reassured her in ways words could not. She could feel the energy around him, the vigilance, the alertness, the silent communication with something beyond her understanding. It was both terrifying and comforting. A coyote howled in the distance, its mournful call slicing through the night, and the wind carried the faint scent of sage and dry earth. Lillian coughed harshly, leaning over the railing, and felt Takoda's shadow fall across the porch without her knowing exactly when he had moved closer. One of his fingers brushed lightly against the railing beside her, almost as if to anchor her against the cold and the fear. The gesture was fleeting, yet it left her heart pounding. Takoda crouched in the moonlight, his bare chest reflecting pale silver, beads and feathers swaying with each subtle motion. He scanned the horizon again, his eyes catching movement in the darkness, a distant flicker of light, perhaps a campfire, perhaps a rider. He said nothing, only exhaled slowly, listening to the night, measuring the distance and weight of invisible threats. Lillian watched him, fascinated and terrified. This was a man who existed in a world she could barely imagine, a world of silence, strategy, and shadows. She wondered briefly about the scars etched along his arms, faded, jagged lines that seemed to tell stories without words. Each mark was a memory, a warning, a testament to battles fought in ways she could never fathom. He lived in a different time, a different code, and yet here he was, guarding her, guarding the land, carrying the weight of a legacy she could barely understand. Hours passed slowly. The wind picked up, rattling the boards of the barn and sending dust curling into the night air. Lillian shivered, hugging her frail body, and Takoda finally rose, moving closer to the porch without breaking the protective silence. He did not speak, did not demand her attention. He simply stood, a sentinel against the encroaching darkness, his long hair and tribal jewelry swaying with the night wind. Finally, Lillian dared a question. Will anyone come?" Her voice was barely audible, trembling. Takoda's gaze softened briefly, though his vigilance never wavered. "They will," he said, voice low and calm. "But only when it is time. For now this land waits, and so do we." The weight of his words settled over her like a shield, and she felt a strange, fragile sense of peace. The night was still alive, mysterious and unpredictable. Yet under Takoda's watchful presence, it also felt safe, even sacred as the hours stretched toward dawn. Lillian closed her eyes, letting exhaustion overtake her. The last thing she felt before sleep claimed her was the steady rhythm of Takoda's presence nearby, a silent promise that the land, and perhaps she herself, was not entirely alone. The ranch lay in shadows, yet it breathed with quiet anticipation, as if the wind and the earth themselves were waiting for what the morning would bring. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the first stirrings of something vast and powerful were beginning to move, slowly, silently, like a heartbeat waiting to erupt. Lillian Marlowe awoke to a strange hum in the distance, a vibration she could feel in her chest before she could hear it with her ears. At first, she thought it was the wind or perhaps her fever playing tricks, but then the rhythm sharpened, steady and deliberate. A low, rolling sound, growing with each heartbeat of the earth beneath her porch. She leaned heavily against the railing, squinting toward the horizon. Dust swirled in the morning light, catching gold and red streaks from the rising sun. Then she saw them, a line of shapes moving across the mesas. At first, she thought it must be her imagination, a mirage of horse and shadow, but as the shapes grew clearer, she realized the truth. 70 warriors rode silently, their presence commanding, their bodies silhouetted against the fiery sunrise. Takoda stepped from the shadows of the barn, his bare chest gleaming in the early light, beads and feathers swaying with each movement. He watched the approaching line with eyes sharp and calm, his hands resting lightly on the reins of his horse. "They honor your gift," he said quietly to Lillian, who felt her pulse quicken. "This land you have given will not be empty." Not while they ride. The warriors rode in perfect formation, silent as the desert air. Painted faces glinted faintly in the sun, feathers braided into hair, leather armor and beaded jewelry catching light in small, dazzling flashes. Not a single word passed their lips, not a shout, not a cry, yet their presence was overwhelming, almost suffocating in its intensity. Lillian's weak body shivered, not from cold, but from awe and fear. Takoda dismounted and moved to her side, standing like a protective wall. His gaze swept over the warriors, then back to her, steady and unwavering. "They do not come to harm," he said. "They come to witness and protect. Your decision was wise, Lillian Marlowe. The land remembers those who honor it." Lillian's hands trembled as she clutched the railing, feeling a mixture of fear, gratitude, and disbelief. She had been too weak to ride out herself, too sick to even manage the simplest chores, but her choice had drawn a force of living power to her land. She felt the weight of it, the enormity of what she had set in motion. The warriors spread across the ranch, their movements deliberate and disciplined. Some dismounted to inspect the fences, the fields, and the corral, their hands gentle yet purposeful. Others surveyed the distant ridges, watching for signs of danger with eyes sharp as hawks. Every gesture spoke of respect for the land, an understanding that this place belonged to more than one person, it belonged to life itself. Takoda knelt near the corral, tracing his fingers along the worn wood of a fence post, as if reading the memory of the ranch through touch. "The land is strong," he murmured, almost to himself. "It will thrive if it is honored." Lillian watched him, her chest tight with emotion. Even in her weakened state, she felt a spark of hope ignite within her, a hope she had long thought impossible. The sun climbed higher, bathing the entire scene in brilliant gold. Dust swirled like living spirits around the horses' hooves, glinting in the light. Lillian felt a breeze brush her cheek, carrying with it the scent of sage and the faint metallic tang of distant hills. Somewhere in that wind she sensed a promise, a future she would not live to see, yet one she had ensured for those who would. Finally, Takoda turned to her, his dark eyes meeting hers. "The ranch is not yours anymore, but it is safe," he said. "You have done more than sell a piece of land. You have entrusted it to those who will honor it, who will protect it, who will let it grow beyond your time." His voice was calm, yet it carried a weight that made her feel both small and infinitely significant. Lillian closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the sun wash over her pale face. She felt the steady pulse of the land beneath her feet, the presence of 70 warriors breathing life into the ranch, and the quiet, unwavering vigilance of Takoda. The ranch was alive again, not because of her, not entirely, but because of the man she had trusted and the people he had summoned. In that moment, Lillian Marlowe understood that her life, fragile as it was, had created a legacy stronger than she could have imagined. The land would endure. It would thrive. And in the silence of the sunrise, with the warriors spread across the fields like living shadows, she allowed herself the smallest, most profound relief: hope. The sun had climbed higher, casting the Marlowe ranch in brilliant golds and reds, yet the air still carried the cool edge of morning. Lillian Marlowe moved slowly along the dusty path toward the corral, leaning heavily on her cane. Her body ached, her breaths came shallow and sharp, but she felt a strange urgency, a need to see the land, to touch it one last time before her weakness could claim her entirely. Takoda walked beside her, bare-chested, his muscular form glistening in the sunlight. Feathers and beads in his long black hair swayed as he moved, and every step he took seemed in perfect harmony with the rhythm of the ranch. He did not speak immediately, letting Lillian take in the fields, the fences, the corrals. Then, softly, he said, "The land speaks to those who listen. It tells you where it will thrive and where it will fail." Lillian glanced at him, curiosity sparking in her tired eyes. "And what does it say?" she asked. Her voice was frail, but it carried a tone of wonder she had not felt in months. Takoda knelt beside a patch of sun-scorched soil, letting his fingers brush the dry earth. "It says that this place is strong, but it needs care," he murmured. "It says that those who fight for it must be patient, must honor it, and must be willing to carry its burdens. And it says," he lifted his gaze to meet hers, steady and piercing, "that it will reward courage, loyalty, and respect in ways you cannot yet imagine." She felt a shiver run through her, a mixture of awe and fear. Even in her weakened state, she sensed something larger than herself at play. Takoda's presence was no longer just a protection, it was a guide, a bridge between her fading life and the enduring legacy of the ranch. As they walked, Lillian noticed the scars etched along Takoda's arms and chest, faded lines that seemed to tell stories without words. "What happened to you?" she asked softly, almost ashamed of the curiosity in her voice. Takoda's gaze did not waver. "Each mark tells of a battle, a lesson, or a loss," he said quietly. Some are my own, and some are reminders of those who could not defend themselves. They teach me why I fight not for glory, but for those who cannot fight for themselves." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage, dry earth, and a faint metallic tang from the distant hills. Lillian's eyes filled with tears she could not fully explain. In this man, she saw a reflection of the land itself, strong, scarred, enduring, and profoundly loyal. Takoda led her to the barn, gently helping her up the worn steps to inspect the roof and walls. "Repairs are needed," he said simply, his eyes scanning every beam, every plank. "But this place will stand. It will live beyond you if it is cared for. And I will see that it is." Lillian's chest tightened. You will stay?" she whispered, almost afraid to hope. He shook his head slightly, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "I stay only to ensure the land thrives," he said. "It is not mine to own, but it is mine to honor." "That is enough." They moved toward the fields next, where the wheat had begun to sprout in stubborn patches, golden tips brushing against the morning light. Takoda knelt beside the soil again, brushing it with careful fingers, and Lillian felt an inexplicable warmth in her chest. "It seems alive," she murmured. "Almost like it's breathing." Takoda's dark eyes softened. "It is alive. Every blade of grass, every creature that walks here, every gust of wind, they are part of it. And because of the warriors, because of those who honor it, it will not die. Not today, not tomorrow, not for a long time." For the first time since her illness had taken hold, Lillian felt a spark of hope. She had feared her life would fade, leaving the ranch to rot in silence. But with Takoda and the warriors who had arrived at her land, she realized that her sacrifice had not been in vain. The ranch would endure, thrive, and live beyond her. She sank onto a wooden fence post, exhausted, and watched Takoda as he stood in the golden light, surveying the land with careful eyes. The wind tugged at his feathers and beads, dust swirling around him like a living spirit. Lillian closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the sun wash over her frail body. In that moment, surrounded by the strength, wisdom, and silent vigilance of the warrior she had entrusted, she allowed herself a rare, fragile comfort, a hope that her legacy would live on, and that the land she loved so dearly would never be forgotten. The sky above the Marlowe ranch darkened in the late afternoon, heavy clouds rolling in from the north. Lillian Marlowe leaned weakly against the porch railing, her pale fingers gripping the wood as the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and dry earth. The temperature had dropped suddenly, and the once golden sunlight was replaced by a cold, silvery haze that painted the mesas in ghostly tones. Takoda moved beside her, bare-chested, muscles taut under the fading light, his long black hair and feathers swaying with the gusts. His dark eyes scanned the horizon with the precision of a hawk, noting the slightest ripple in the dust or shadow. The 30 or 40 miles of open land separating them from the northern ridge no longer felt safe. Lillian's heart quickened as she sensed the tension in the air, even if she could not see the danger clearly. "They are coming," he said softly, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact. Lillian turned to him, confusion and fear mingling in her eyes. "Who? What do you mean?" Takoda's gaze remained fixed on the distant ridges, where faint clouds of dust were now visible, rolling steadily toward the ranch. "Old enemies," he said. "Those who do not forget, who do not forgive. They will test this land, but they will not break it." Lillian's breath caught in her throat. She had feared for herself, for the ranch, for the legacy she hoped to leave behind, but she had not imagined that her gift could attract danger so quickly. Her frail body trembled against the porch railing. Can we stop them?" She whispered. Takoda placed a steady hand on her shoulder, grounding her with his presence. His touch was warm, reassuring, and oddly calming despite the storm in the distance. "We will not run," he said quietly. "We will stand. And we will protect what belongs to those who honor it." He moved toward the corral, signaling to a few of the warriors who had remained nearby in silent vigilance. Even without words, they understood him, spreading out with disciplined precision. The horses pawed the earth, muscles coiled and ready, eyes alert, ears twitching at the slightest sound. Lillian watched, shivering from a mix of cold and anticipation, as Takoda and the warriors prepared the ranch as if it were a living fortress. Breathing and alert. The wind shifted again, carrying distant voices faintly on its currents. Not much, just whispers, but enough to make the hairs on Lillian's arms rise. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her pulse spike with fear and awe. Takoda returned to her side, scanning her face with a look that was both protective and calculating. "Do not be afraid," he said. "Courage is not the absence of fear, it is acting despite it." The clouds overhead darkened further, and the first drops of rain spattered against the dry earth, hissing as they touched sun-baked soil. Dust mingled with the raindrops, creating a hazy, almost mystical effect over the ranch. The warriors adjusted, moving silently, blending into the shadows and the landscape, their painted faces and beaded jewelry catching the fleeting light. Lillian could feel their collective presence, the discipline, the power, the unwavering loyalty, and it filled her with a strange comfort. Hours passed as they waited, the storm and approaching threat testing the ranch's resolve. Lillian, exhausted, sat on a low fence post, clutching her thin shawl around her shoulders, watching Takoda move among the warriors with a quiet authority. Every gesture, every glance, every shift of his weight seemed purposeful, as if he could communicate without a word and orchestrate the defense of the land with invisible threads. Finally, the clouds parted slightly, revealing the first hint of the setting sun. The distant ridge now glimmered with faint dust plumes, the movement of riders approaching in calculated silence. Lillian's chest tightened. The moment of truth had arrived. The land she had entrusted, the legacy she hoped to preserve, was about to be tested. And in the center of it all stood Takoda, silent, muscular, commanding, and ready. Lillian took a deep, shuddering breath, letting the wind whip through her hair. She knew that whatever came next, the ranch would not face it alone. The warriors, the land, and the man who had taken her gift into his hands would stand together, united against the shadows of the past. And somehow, in that tense, electric air, she felt a flicker of hope stronger than fear. The first rays of sunrise spilled across the Marlowe ranch like molten gold, igniting the red dust in a blaze of light. Lillian Marlowe leaned against the railing of the porch, frail and trembling, but her eyes shone with something they had not in weeks: anticipation. The night's storm had passed, leaving the air crisp, scented with wet earth and sage, and carrying a whisper of promise. Takoda stood at the edge of the corral, bare-chested, his long black hair glinting with the first light, feathers and beads swaying gently. His muscular frame, bronzed and scarred, radiated calm authority, a stark contrast to the adrenaline and fear that had gripped the ranch only hours before. Behind him, the 70 Apache warriors had spread across the fields, their presence silent yet imposing, each figure a sentinel against the past that had threatened to destroy the land. Lillian took a hesitant step down from the porch, leaning on her cane, then paused to let the scene sink in. Dust from the previous day's storm still lingered, twisting in the golden sunlight, turning each shaft of light into a living river of color. The warriors moved like shadows across the land, inspecting the fences, barns, and fields, ensuring everything was secure. And in the center of it all, Takoda's gaze swept over the ranch, not as a conqueror but as a guardian, a man who understood the land as intimately as she had once hoped to, You did it, Lillian whispered, her voice hoarse but filled with awe. You kept it? Safe. Takoda's dark eyes met hers. We all did, he said quietly. The land remembers those who honor it. You have given it a chance to live beyond yourself. That is what matters, she nodded, letting a tear escape down her cheek. Months of fear, illness, and uncertainty had brought her to this fragile, luminous moment. The land she had loved and nurtured, the ranch she had feared would die with her, was alive again. Protected by strength she could only hope to understand. One of the warriors, a young man with braided hair and a painted face, approached and knelt respectfully before her, holding out a small bundle. She opened it to find a sprig of sage tied with leather, a symbol of protection and endurance. She pressed it to her chest, feeling a strange surge of warmth and gratitude. Takoda approached, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. This is your legacy, Lillian Marlowe. It is not mine, not theirs, it is yours. And it will thrive because you honored it. The sound of hooves stirred behind her. She turned to see the warriors mounting their horses, forming a perfect line that stretched across the sunrise. They rode in silence, a living testament to loyalty and strength, before dispersing across the distant ridges to patrol and protect the land as they had promised. Dust rose in columns behind them, shimmering like gold in the morning light, creating an almost mystical vision of guardianship. Lillian sank onto the porch steps, exhausted, but her chest lifted with a lightness she had not felt in months. The fever and weakness that had defined her life seemed to retreat for a moment, replaced by something more enduring, hope. She glanced at Takoda, who remained standing, scanning the horizon as though he could anticipate every threat before it arrived. His presence was a tether, grounding her to a sense of safety, purpose, and trust. You've given me peace, she whispered, her voice barely audible, yet carrying the weight of profound gratitude. Even if I don't have long, I know the ranch will live. Takoda inclined his head, the sun illuminating the sharp planes of his face. The intensity in his eyes softened by respect and something almost like reverence. You have done more than survive, Lillian, he said. You have ensured life continues. That is the measure of courage. The wind swept across the fields, lifting dust, feathers, and strands of hair, carrying the scent of sage and wet earth. Lillian closed her eyes, letting it wash over her, feeling the pulse of the land, the strength of Takoda and the warriors, and the quiet eternity of a legacy preserved. For a final, fleeting moment, the ranch seemed suspended in perfection, the barns glowing, the corral standing proud, the fields brushing against the wind, and the warriors blending seamlessly into the horizon. Lillian smiled weakly, her chest rising with the knowledge that she had done all she could. The land would endure. Her name would endure. And in the quiet majesty of the Old West sunrise, she allowed herself a rare, full sense of peace. Takoda mounted his horse, giving her a final, steady nod, and the warriors followed, their silhouettes fading into the golden light. Lillian watched them go, knowing she had witnessed something timeless, a legacy born of courage, trust, and the strength of a land that refused to die. And as the first full rays of sun touched the earth, the Marlowe Ranch stood alive, eternal, and unbroken.